Hello, welcome to this segment of the program where we're going to be talking about personas, professionalism, and toxic workplaces. And I'm going to make some pretty bold claims based on my experience. If you've been around in your profession for some time, I expect a lot of this will resonate. If you're new to the field, I risk sounding a little bit cynical, a little bit jaded, and I will add a caveat of saying that I hope your experience is very different than mine. When I think about professionalism, I think what it's supposed to be is being highly skilled, being competent in your role, and certainly behaving within an ethical framework. But my experience of professionalism is a lot like what I watched my children go through in grade school. For young children, when their behavior is not acceptable, they were often admonished as being quote unquote inappropriate. And I struggled with that when my children were chastised that way, because to say that something is inappropriate is to imply that there's a universal standard for what is appropriate. And I think the same idea applies to professionalism. We have ideas about what it means to behave professionally. We have ideas about what a professional appearance is. And honestly, I think they're rarely spelled out. I think it's assumed that we all know what those are. I think they're homogenous in nature, and I see that as something that stifles creativity, individuality, and I don't see vulnerability as something that we have traditionally defined as being part of professionalism. And so, for those reasons, it's not really something that I want in my workplace. It's not something that I want from my employees. And it's not something that I see as being terribly beneficial to clients. I mean, certainly we're going to give them our best efforts. We're going to continue to focus our skills, and we're always going to behave ethically. But to be genuine is far more important to me than to be professional. I realize that so much of that is about appearances. I have a good friend, Keith, who's a brilliant therapist. And every semester we guest lecture in each other's classes. And there's an experiment that I do very briefly with the students where I ask them to compare what they've experienced with Keith and I, because we have very similar backgrounds, very similar education, and we have a very similar approach to therapy. So our beliefs and values are highly congruent. Our approach is different, and our appearances are very different. My friend Keith is a very good looking guy. He looks like what we would traditionally call a professional. He's very well dressed, he's very well coiffed. He for all intents and purposes, looks exactly like what you would think a male therapist looks like. And then I go to my students and say, okay, so if you compare Keith to somebody who looks like me, do you assume that you're talking to very similar people with very similar beliefs and values who approach healing and helping in very similar ways? And of course, they all say no. And so I'll invite them to explore why that is. And at face value, they'll identify things like the length of my hair, they'll identify things like my tattoos and my piercings. And if they're especially bold, they'll identify something that you can't see on video, which is that I happen to be an amputee. And so those are all things that set me outside of the norm of my profession. And in some cases, that creates interest, and in other cases, it creates concern, or it raises the question of whether or not I'm terribly professional, which I'm not. I am professional in terms of being very skilled and behaving in the best interests of my clients and colleagues, sure. But I'm also incredibly authentic. I know myself well. Later on in this series, we're going to be talking about identity and helping our clients and ourselves to create a greater sense of what that is. I think typically we have a strong awareness of the roles that we participate in and the relationships that we have with others and who we are and how we are with those people. But I think what's conspicuously absent is an awareness of self and a value of self that exists independently of what we do. So I look forward to exploring that with you further. I want to challenge some of the notions that you may have about what is expected of you and how it is that you ought to behave, and really to ask you to consider, where do those ideas come from? Are they specific to your employer? Are they based in training or formal education? Are there things that you simply observed in your superiors and supervisors? But let's delve a little bit into, how do you want to be? Who is the person that you most want to be personally and professionally? And how much fun is that person having? How many ways has that person found to be effective? And how is it that we'll be true to ourselves when we don't have a strong sense of identity? Things to ponder, and we'll be back with more in the next video.